Welcome to Character Explorations, a podcast production of the Wendt Center for Character Education at the University of Dubuque. I'm Annalee Ward, the director of the Wendt Center, and our guest today is Dr. Adam Kleinschmit, Associate Professor of Biology. He is the author of the article, Transformative Discovery Science, Character and Play as Key Elements. And if you enjoy this conversation, you also might like to read the essay. It is available online at dbq.edu/WENDT. That's dbq.edu/Wendt. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you, Annalee.
You wrote this article for the journal issue, Character and Play, which I imagine was a stretch for you as a research and teaching scientist. Why don't you share a little bit about you and your particular interest in biology?
Yes, thank you. So I'm a molecular biologist, and that means I get to tinker with all kinds of things that we can't see on the surface, including microbes, which I bring up in my article. But I get to do both laboratory and field research with students. A lot of my research is focused on environmental microbiology, so looking at microbial communities in the environment.
Microbial communities. Is that what got you interested or in your topic for our paper today?
So one of the things we'll likely talk about is agar art, which includes making art with live microbes. And so there's a lot of playful elements in there, and so that did come to mind as starting to think about this more broad topic.
Agar art, where do you see something like that?
So you can see agar art at some prominent international science conferences that focus on microbiology. A lot of the output from agar art competitions can be found online as well. So Googling or doing a basic web search for agar art will bring you lots of colorful images that we're living.
It really is a fascinating image. So I encourage our listeners to look it up. And it's fun. It's fun to see what can be created with this living matter. So what is the culture like in scientific research today?
Yes. So the culture predominantly, if you had to summarize it, is, I would say, very competitive, especially in the academic sphere of research. So competitive. And with the competitive atmosphere, there becomes lots of pressure to do things such as publish and obtain grant funding. And so I imagine we'll talk a little bit more about what those pressures may do in terms of character and how play may help alleviate some of those pressures.
It sounds like a culture that is pressured, that is intense, and that doesn't fit very well with play. Does it raise concerns for you today?
Yes. So when we talk about discovery science, so here I'm thinking about science that is focused on in the quest of knowledge opposed to immediate application of that knowledge. A lot of key discoveries over the years have come from unexpected tinkering, if you will, with the forefront of research.
Do you have any examples of that tinkering? And talk to us about people who have tinkered.
Yes, so Alexander Fleming, who is featured in the article, is known to have a playful approach to his research back in the 1920s when he was active. And so, for example, he would take unique microbes that were pigmented and essentially make a collection of them. And he would engage in what I referred to as agar art previously. And so he is kind of the founder of agar art. And from that, likely he noticed interesting interactions from microbes. So some microbes can create compounds that inhibit other microbes as they compete for limited resources. And so some of those observations he made from playing and creating art and masterpieces likely fueled into his research. Some of his interests were looking at how microbes make compounds that can inhibit other microbes.
And what did that lead to?
And so that ultimately led to the discovery of the antibiotic penicillin, and subsequent antibiotics that have come after the discovery of penicillin have used similar methods to what Alexander Fleming used.
Aha, I see the connection. So he was playing in his discovery of penicillin. He was having fun with the art and yet discovered something. You also mentioned someone by the name of Katalin Kariko as a risk taker and boundary breaker. Why don't you tell us about her and why she's important?
Yes, Katalin Kariko. She's fascinating in that a lot of her research interests at that time were not validated by her peers and were not thought to be meritable research. And she had a lot of trouble getting grant funding to support her research. But interestingly, unlike most scientists that are kind of thinking about long-term and maintaining a scientific career, she stood firm with her research interests and continued to pursue that research, which ultimately led to multiple demotions, and eventually she exited out of the academic sphere. But decades later, some of her contributions back at that time have led to some transformative discoveries that include some of the components that are part of messenger RNA-based vaccines and therapeutics.
Something key to our emerging from COVID concerns, right? Was that important in that vaccine development?
Yes. So two of the most prominent COVID vaccines that were developed in the first 11 months of the pandemic are based on technology that was stemmed from some of her research in the 1990s.
You mentioned peer review and its importance in science, and I don't think anybody would deny that peer review is important, but there are other factors that have contributed to this culture that raise concerns for you. What's it like today for scientists in a research environment?
Yeah, so academic scientists face a lot of pressure as it's a very competitive sphere. And so pressure to do things that will establish them as scientists, and this includes publication, so frequent publication, bringing in large amounts of research funding, publishing in what are considered high-tier journals. All these are essentially metrics that kind of measure scientists, and scientists are compared based on these metrics, which are kind of these external tools. And this can lead scientists away from internal motivation. If there's enough pressure, you can imagine a scientist perhaps shifting their research interest in order to get funding based on where funding might be. And this can even potentially lead some scientists that are under a lot of pressure astray and even compromise their morals.
What do you mean by compromising their morals? How would they do that in science?
Yeah, so it's really a continuum on how one's character might be challenged. Kind of on one end of the spectrum, you can imagine a scientist knowing that they need to publish in order to keep these metrics boosted, may do maybe a superficial analysis of some of their data set and not take as much time while trying to get a number of papers out, right? And that's not great for science. And during that process, they may make some errors they don't realize, right? So that's kind of on one side of the continuum. On the other far side of the continuum, scientists under immense pressure to get funding to continue to do the research may actually cross a line of doing unethical conduct of research. So something such as fabricating data.
Do you see that happening, the data fabrication today?
Yeah, so there are a number of groups that monitor articles that have been red flagged and do investigations and promote investigations to uncover potential breaches of ethics such as that. And so it is out there. Its prevalence is relatively low, but things like that can really change the public's perception of science and potentially lose trust in science.
Absolutely. So what I'm hearing you say is that we've got this culture today that is produce, 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 and yet the things that we look back on in history that have changed science have been less of an emphasis on production and more of an emphasis on play. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so how could we encourage, foster this spirit of play in science?
Yeah, so steps to try to foster play. So it's thinking about ways to kind of turn down the dial of pressure would allow for more room for play. And kind of what I'm thinking about here is allowing scientists to take greater risks, right? Instead of trying to address more narrow questions or more guaranteed to produce some data that can be easily publishable to kind of bolster these metrics in order to continue being a scientist, they can take into account perhaps more interesting questions that are maybe a little bit more risky, where they may not get data that is publishable right away. So perhaps providing funding mechanisms that are kind of longer in duration, that provide more room for play and stumbling around, as well as potentially even integrating play within grants. So for example, we could take a note from industry, private industry. So for example, corporations such as 3M, Google, and Adobe have programs where they provide some time for their employees to follow kind of their passion projects without necessarily reporting out. So Google, for example, has what's they call the 20% program. So 20% of employees' time is kind of following these pet or passion projects, and they tinker around and can kind of play with things. And if something comes to fruition, then they can share with the greater group.
That sounds like a luxury that is not very often available in higher ed. Tinker time. Is there a way that you can encourage play with your students learning to do research?
Yeah, so one way would to really encourage, for example, undergraduates to pursue some of their own research questions. So often in this type of field, we often see primary investigators or academics kind of pushing their research agenda, but allowing students to help mold that can often uncover things or assumptions that scientists that are more seasoned look beyond. So that might be one way to encourage more play.
That's great. It just sounds like we need more administrators, more cultures in education to create this space for that and to relieve some of the pressure on you. I'm sorry, I'm just thinking of all kinds of side tangents. I just have to ask my question. It has nothing to do with your paper. But do you see artificial intelligence coming into scientific research in ways that would give you any space to incorporate more play?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So artificial intelligence is kind of busting out in the scenes in many different areas, including research. I guess one thing I think about right away is potentially using AI to take tasks that are not necessarily, that are cognitively draining, but don't really contribute to novel thinking kind of out of the way. So kind of automating some tasks. So for example, a lot of big data sets require writing code. And when writing code, small mistakes can essentially kind of stop the process and really take away a lot of time. And so having AI help write code is something that could be utilized, be useful, as well as some automated processing of large data sets that have images, for example, to search for things, to try to find patterns where just the human eye wouldn't be able to find. This provides perhaps a little bit more space for diving into new ideas.
It's wonderful to hear some of the positives because so often we hear the negatives of AI. And I'm thinking, that trying to find ways to open up space for play in science could generate new opportunities, new discoveries that will transform our future in positive ways. Adam, thank you for your insights on the state of scientific research today. This encouragement to incorporate an emphasis on virtue, which maybe we didn't talk a lot about, but in your paper you do talk about how important it is to have integrity. And your encouragement to emphasize room for play. These are important steps in addressing the problems generated by an emphasis on productivity. As we draw this to a close, is there any last comments you wanted to make or anything, last observations you had about play in science?
Yeah, so I would say that leaving space for play is important for discovery science, especially transformative discovery science, as it allows researchers to take on more risk and ask kind of those bigger questions, which may transform a field or perhaps even generate a novel field.
Thank you, Adam. Our guest today has been Dr. Adam Kleinschmit, Associate Professor of Biology at the University of Dubuque. And I'm Annalee Ward for Character Explorations from the Wendt Center for Character Education at the University of Dubuque.